Hi, welcome to session number 4 of our 12-hour report writing course. This course is approved by the Division of Workers' Compensation for all QME candidates hoping to receive their QME credential. And we have a lot of work to cover today and over the next several sessions, so let's just all get on the same page as to where we are and where we're going in this program. Recall that prior to becoming appointed as a qualified medical evaluator, you must complete a course of at least 12 hours of instruction in disability evaluation report writing. And this course offers many more hours than just the 12-hour minimum. And we have many additional resources to accompany this course. And so this course is a comprehensive course in disability evaluation report writing. And if you ever have any questions or concerns about any particular report that you're writing in the future as a qualified medical evaluator, you can always call our company. You can call me personally, and I will help you resolve any issues that you may be encountering. And recall that the entirety of this requirement is described in California Code of Regulation 11.5. And this regulation not only details what topics need to be covered in such a disability evaluation report writing course, it then goes into the sub-content within each of these major topic headings. So a thorough understanding of this code of regulation will give you a good idea as to what is required in the system of us in terms of producing high-quality reports that can actually resolve disputed issues in the California workers' compensation system. So in session number 1, we talked about the QME's role in the disability evaluation process, and we're going to talk much more about that in today's discussion as well. In section number 2, we talked about the elements of the medical legal report. And what elements mean is, elements mean the different section headings within the body of your QME report. A QME report by law must contain several required elements, several required sections that we're required to discuss within the body of our report, and those are known and referred to as the elements of the medical legal report. And I shared with you what those were in session number 2 and showed you how to begin to set up your template for each and every one of your evaluations according to the required elements. In session number 3, we talked about the Administrative Director's Disability Evaluation Protocols. There wasn't a lot there, but what was there was very important, and it had to deal with what's required and what are the minimum requirements of us in conducting our evaluations of the various different injured body parts, body systems, and body regions. Today, we're going to begin a large block of topics dealing with the language of reports, and we're going to get right down into the nitty-gritty and break apart into their component elements the topic headings that were described in session number 2. I'm going to show you some of the philosophy behind how we conduct these evaluations and how this philosophy has evolved over the years to bring us to the current state that we are in, which is where we are required to use the AMA guides, 5th edition, for the production of at least the disability evaluation component of our reports. And this is going to be several sessions in length because the requirement is for a minimum of 4 hours of instruction in this particular topic. So we're going to go on for a couple of sessions on this topic of the language of reports, after which we'll get into the third-party perspective. We'll get into another large block of topics related to the anatomy of a good report. We'll put it all together in our final section, and I'll show you some ways that you can efficiently, effectively, and profitably produce these evaluations. And then we'll have our final assignment for this course, which is the submission and critique of a well-written medical legal report. Okay, so that's the topics contained within the 12-hour report writing program. Let's now get into session number 4 and introduce the topics involving the language of reports. Now, the language of reports and the topics that are required to be addressed in this particular section of this course and program are also described in California Code of Regulation 11.5. And let's just go through some of these subtopic headings. And the topic of today's discussion is the evaluation of disability in California. And we'll talk at great length about how your report factors into the overall scheme of the workers' compensation system. We'll talk about such topics as the review of records and how this will look within the body of your report. We'll talk about the importance of obtaining a good occupational history from your examinee. We'll talk about the physical examination and the role of diagnostic testing in the new era that involves the AMA guides. So then we'll talk for some time about the AMA guides. And particularly we're going to focus on a concept and how the AMA guides set importance to the concept of the activities of daily living. And just to share with you some advanced notice about this topic, when you get to your face-to-face evaluation with your injured worker, your physical examination is going to be no more important than your activities of daily living assessment of your examinee. And let me state that a different way. Let me say that your activities of daily living assessment that you do in the face-to-face evaluation with your examinee is going to be as important as any of your physical examination findings, because both of those components, the limitations and activities of daily living that you discover in interviewing with your examinee and your physical examination findings, both of those contribute equally to providing your impairment rating for your examinee. So we'll introduce the topic of activities of daily living in today's discussion. And then we'll talk about providing opinions that resolve disputed medical treatment issues, consistent with California Code of Regulation 35.5. We talked a little bit about this in our last session and talked about what your obligation is in producing your medical legal report. Your obligation is to answer questions that the parties have of us, of you. And the parties provide their questions to us and to you in their issue cover letters that are sent to us in advance of the face-to-face evaluation. So there's an exact science, there's an exact communication skill that I'm going to share with you as to how to answer questions in such a way that your answers actually help to resolve the disputed issues quickly, accurately, and the first time through in a very efficient manner. We'll talk about the factors of disability and how work restrictions and work capabilities factor into disability determinations. And this is something that's mostly related to injuries prior to 2005, which you might think have nothing to do with you, and you're mostly correct. You know, at the time you receive your QME credential, you will rarely encounter an injury prior to 2005. However, you will be encountering examinees who have had an injury after 1105, of course, but you will also encounter examinees who, in addition to their injury after 1105, have another injury prior to 1105. I mean, that's not unheard of in this work that we do. And so you still need to know something about how disabilities were rated prior to the point in time when you were credentialed as a qualified medical evaluator, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that here under this topic heading. And then continuing on with our theme, we're going to go through some discussions of some various concepts and terms, including permanent and stationary, sometimes referred to as maximum medical improvement. And I'll share with you how you can determine when your examinee actually reaches a permanent and stationary condition, or when they actually achieve a maximum medical improvement. And I'll show you how to establish the date of the permanent and stationary date, which is a very critical date for the distribution and determination of benefits that are provided to injured workers. We'll talk about apportionment, and I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on this particular topic because of all the concepts in California workers' compensation and of all the issues upon which we as qualified medical evaluators need to comment upon. Qualified medical evaluators as a group and across the board find the apportionment opinion to be the most difficult section of their report. Bar none, hands down, coming up with the apportionment determination seems to be very, very difficult for qualified medical evaluators. But I'm going to simplify this determination for you in such a way that you can quickly and accurately, that's the key word, is accurately, come up with apportionment percentages that are accurate and are likely, most likely, true. And there's an exact science to doing this, and I'm going to share it with you as we get into those topics. Finally, we'll talk about future medical care and how to provide your opinions for future care medical treatment recommendations for injured workers who do have a permanent disability. And then finally, perhaps most important of all, we're going to talk about how you can provide sufficient support for every single opinion and every single conclusion that you offer within the body of your report. And this is an important concept because in California workers' compensation, simply an opinion or simply a conclusion in the body of your report is not enough. It's not enough. Now, opinions and conclusions in your clinical practice and your opinions and conclusions that you write in other non-workers' compensation reports might be sufficient to get that report through the parties. But in California workers' compensation, for each opinion and each conclusion that you offer in the body of your report, you must support that opinion and you must support that conclusion with how and why reasons. How and why reasons as to why and how you came up with this particular opinion or conclusion. It's no longer sufficient to just give an opinion. Those opinions and conclusions that you offer have to be supported in such a way that the support lends credibility and substantiability to that opinion or conclusion. The concept has to deal with substantial medical evidence, and the word substantial is taken from the word substance. So we're going to show you how to provide substance to every opinion and conclusion that you offer in the body of your report. So those are our topics over the next 4 hours. Let's get into now a discussion as to how disability is evaluated in California and how your reports are used in the system to resolve disputed issues regarding California's injured workers. Okay, so let's begin and let's talk about how disability is evaluated in California workers' compensation. And specifically, we're going to talk about our role, the role of the qualified medical evaluator in these disability evaluations. Our role is critical. It's critical because workers rely on compensation during disability periods. And as we're going to learn, there's two basic disability periods. There's there's temporary disability periods and there are permanent disability periods. And the separation between those periods is the date of the permanent and stationary declaration. So say, for example, an examinee is determined to be permanent and stationary on September 1st, 2023. All benefits provided prior to that date qualify as temporary disability benefits, and benefits that are provided after that date are referred to as permanent disability benefits. And the physicians, such as you and I, dictate the type and the amount of disability payments. So we determine when an examinee qualifies for temporary disability benefits. We determine when an examinee qualifies for permanent disability benefits. And based upon our medical findings and medical recommendations, we determine the amount of disability payments based upon that examinee's level of permanent impairment, which then gets converted into a level of permanent disability. And higher levels of permanent disability guarantee greater payment payouts, whereas lower disability ratings and awards result in lower disability payments or payouts. So therefore, clarity and accuracy, with emphasis on the word accuracy, is vital for understanding the terminology and the concepts associated with disability evaluations, all of which have as their intended purposes to provide benefits to persons injured in the course of their work duties that are accurate and that are appropriate for each situation. So the evaluation process basically occurs, this is the permanent disability evaluation process that is, occurs once the injured workers are stable, are stationary, are plateaued, and this is what is referred to as permanent and stationary, also known as maximum medical improvement. Now, you may have evaluations where the examinee comes to you and you may determine that the examinee is not permanent and stationary. If the examinee is not permanent and stationary, then the evaluation that you conduct at that time is not a permanent disability evaluation. Permanent disability evaluations that result in a rating that then goes on to resolve the injured worker's disability payouts, those occur only when the examinee is at maximum medical improvement, also known as at permanent and stationary. Now, permanent disability evaluation reports can only be provided and prepared by a limited population of physicians. One group of physicians that can prepare these types of report is the primary treating physician. Now, hopefully in California workers' compensation, most cases can be resolved with a report, with an accurate report from the primary treating physician. And that's the preferred method, that's the preferred route, that's the preferred outcome, and that's the least expensive outcome, is to have the primary treating physician who knows the examinee best, who knows the examinee well, to produce a final disability evaluation report that the parties can agree to accept and that can then go on to be used to close the case. Now, it's only when there are disputes with the primary treating physician's report that either agreed medical evaluators or qualified medical evaluators are called in to render a new second opinion or a new fresh opinion, or to give the matter a new look with a new set of eyes. So our reports should be clear for non-medical stakeholders. This is an important idea that has to do with remembering who is the audience that's going to end up reading our report. Our audience is not doctors. They are non-medical stakeholders such as claims adjusters, attorneys, workers' compensation judges, disability evaluation raters down at the disability evaluation unit in Oakland. In other words, our reports are used by non-medical persons. So therefore, it's very, very important that you learn a communication style of being able to translate from medical language into lay person language your opinions, your conclusions, your findings, such that these lay person, non-medical persons can understand the report and can use the report to resolve disputed issues. Okay, so then what happens when your report is issued in general? Now, there's many different ways that these claims are settled and these cases are resolved, and we'll talk about some of these different pathways that can bring these cases and claims to resolution. But in general, one of the ways involves the use of your report by the Disability Evaluation Unit down in Oakland, California. So there's a unit down there on Clay Street in Oakland called the DEU, the Disability Evaluation Unit, and this is where all reports end up. And down at the DEU are a group of professionals known as disability raters who take our reports and then do the administrative work on those reports to determine what is the injured worker's final disability rating. And there's a bit of work that goes on behind the scenes, and we talked a little bit about that in our last session, which has to do with Labor Code section 4660, which talks about how our reports are then converted into a disability rating. So this all takes place down at the DEU. So in many of your cases, you will also be sending a copy of your report to the DEU. Now, not in every single case will you do this, but in those cases that involve an unrepresented injured worker, meaning the worker has no attorney, and for whom you determine that injured worker is permanent and stationary, and that injured worker has a permanent impairment rating, your report will then be sent. You will send it to the DEU, and the DEU will work its magic on that report to help bring the case to a resolution and to a payout for the injured worker. So our permanent disability rating schedule is what links the impairment that we provide in our reports to a disability rating that can be used to compensate the injured worker for their losses and for their losses of future earning capacity as a worker moving forward in the world of work. Therefore, our evaluation in many ways, in so many ways, I'm going to share some of those with you throughout this program, influences the permanent disability rating and therefore the permanent disability award or the compensation that's awarded to the injured worker. And therefore, because the stakes are so high, it's critical that you always strive for the accurate, perfectly accurate determination in your report, because injured workers count on you for accuracy, claims administrators count on you for accuracy, all of the attorneys are counting on you for accuracy, and each of the parties is calculating the benefit amount down to the penny. So it's critical that your ratings be accurate, never understated, never overstated, but exactly properly stated in a manner that is accurate. So our evaluation influences these financial payouts and also influences the payout and the eligibility for future medical treatments for this injured worker moving forward for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, or even lifetime number of years to assist and to provide medical treatment benefits to these persons who are permanently disabled as a result of an on-the-job injury. It's our report that sets the stage for these very important and very valuable benefits as well. Thus, the necessity of careful, thoughtful, and accurate permanent disability evaluations. So how are these disability evaluations obtained? In other words, how do you get the job? How are you called in to do an evaluation on an injured worker? Well, the process whereby you are assigned these cases varies depending upon the date of injury and whether or not the examinee is represented or unrepresented. We talked a little bit about this in session number 1. This is what's referred to as the QME panel process. And I suggest that you know the QME panel process down to the molecular level, because if you can understand the QME panel process, you can understand exactly what is your role, what is your duties, and what is the sequence of steps, even down to the micro step that you need to perform in your face-to-face evaluation. Because each of these evaluations are different, and if you can understand what it is, what is the disputed issue that brings this case to you in the first place, then you know exactly what you need to do in order to resolve that disputed issue. And that all begins by understanding first the QME panel process. So we refer to those injured workers who have an attorney, we refer to those as represented injured workers, and then therefore the opposite of the represented injured worker is the unrepresented injured worker. Now I can tell you, in my experience, the ratio of represented to unrepresented injured worker cases that you're going to get throughout the course of your career is roughly going to be about 90-10. 90% of all cases will come to you as represented injured workers, where only 10% of those cases that you're going to be called upon to evaluate are actually unrepresented injured workers. So the whole process begins first, and usually this is the general scenario, but of course everything that we're talking about has exceptions and has weird case scenarios, but in general, for accepted cases, you'll have an injured worker who's been receiving treatment from a primary treating physician, known as the PTP. And then when the PTP determines that the examinee or the patient or the injured worker is at permanent and stationary status, then the primary treating physician does a permanent and stationary evaluation. Okay, so this is the ideal scenario, that you have a responsible primary treating physician, and the primary treating physician renders the first report on the examinee's condition. And the primary treating physician does this on what's known as a PR4 form. This is a California-specific permanent and stationary form. It has pre-populated content that the primary treating physician then responds to the topics in the PR4 form, and the primary treating physician submits the PR4 form. Now, the primary treating physician in the alternative can also submit a narrative report if he or she so determines that a narrative report is necessary, or if he or she determines that the PR4 form does not contain sufficient detail to encapsulate all of the nuances of the case, then the primary treating physician has the option to submit a detailed report. This is an option. The completion of the PR4 form, however, is what's allowed and what's provided for by law. Now, the primary treating physician's report then can be used by all the parties. If all the parties agree to the determinations in the primary treating physician's report, that report can then lead to claim settlement, or if the parties do not agree with the conclusions or outcome of the primary treating physician's report, then that report can then initiate the medical legal process, which then results in you or I being called in to evaluate that particular claim. So if there is some contestation or some dispute over one or more of the findings of the primary treating physician's report, that then begins the process. So when we talk about contestation, what are some of the things, what are some of the issues that one or the other of the parties could contest about the primary treating physician's opinions or conclusions? Well, how about, for example, a dispute over the permanent and stationary status of the examinee? Can you imagine that an examinee is receiving treatment on an ongoing basis, what seems to be an extended period of time, and is issuing ongoing progress reports that indicates that the examinee or the injured worker is not recovering, is not doing well, and needs more and more medical treatment? Can you imagine a situation where the where the claims administrator, raises the timeout symbol and says, hey, we dispute this ongoing medical treatment. We believe that the examinee should be permanent and stationary by now. Let's call in a qualified medical evaluator to make a determination. And this is just one example of a dispute. Similarly, the injured worker could dispute a permanent and stationary declaration by the primary treating physician, where the primary treating physician has declared the injured worker to be permanent and stationary, and the injured worker says, no, I'm not permanent and stationary yet. I'm still having pain. I'm still having problems. I can't go back to work yet. You said I can go back to work. I can't go back to work. And there's a dispute over permanent and stationary. And there's many, many different issues over which disputes can arise. And we talked a little bit about those in session number 1 of this program. So if there is some dispute regarding the primary treating physician's evaluation, then a comprehensive evaluation is done by either an AME or a QME, if the injured worker is represented, or only by a QME if the injured worker is unrepresented. So this is an interesting point and an important point. For represented injured workers, the parties, and let's think about who the parties are. The parties are the injured worker's attorney, known as the applicant attorney, the claims administrator, the claims administrator's attorney, known as the defense attorney. There can be as many as 4 parties. Sometimes we don't have a defense attorney. Sometimes we only have 3 parties. But at any time, even before the issuance of the primary treating physician's report, at any time, the parties, whether there be 3 parties or 4 parties, can agree to use an agreed medical evaluator. And the agreed medical evaluator need not be a qualified medical evaluator, but they have this option. If they cannot agree on an agreed medical evaluator, then that initiates the QME panel process. And the QME panel process is roughly the same with a few nuances. It's roughly the same for both represented and unrepresented injured workers. Okay? And then, so therefore, in the resolution of this disputed issue, the only doctors who can provide a resolution to these disputed issues are the primary treating physician, the qualified medical evaluator, or in those rare cases where an agreed medical evaluator has been assigned to the case, it's only these three types of reports that are considered by the compensation judges for both represented and unrepresented injured workers. This should say unrepresented and represented injured workers. In other words, no medical evaluation can be sought outside of the limited confines of these three particular groups of evaluating physicians. Now, then, if the case goes to trial, then it's the judge that determines the disability factors. In other words, gets very clear on what it is that we as the qualified medical evaluator are describing as the disability factors or the impairment rating. And then the judge requests the disability evaluation unit for a formal rating to come up with the permanent disability rating for this examinee's particular situation. Okay, so once we have that rating, let's see what can happen depending upon whether the injured worker is a represented injured worker or whether the injured worker is an unrepresented injured worker. So for represented workers aiming for a settlement between the parties, sort of a behind-the-scenes settlement, the involved parties can use the physician's report and the DEU rating to compute the worker's permanent disability level and can then agree on a settlement amongst the parties. And either party meaning the injured worker and their attorney, or the claims administrator and their attorney, either party can opt out of using a PTP's report by declaring a dispute with one or more issues in that report, and can agree on an AME, this is for represented injured workers, or they can choose a QME to perform the evaluation. And this is how we get the job. We get these jobs by the gobs and gobs. If an unrepresented injured worker disputes the claims adjuster's rating, the claims adjuster's quotation of the rating, the worker themselves can seek a DEU rating through this same process. And if either party contests the primary treating physician's evaluation, this is either the injured worker or the claims administrator disputing the primary treating physician's determination, a QME evaluation is obtainable and it can be initiated by either of those parties. Either the injured worker can initiate the process or the claims administrator can initiate the process. So therefore, knowing this sequence of events of how our reports get used by the parties, get used by the judges, and get used by the disability evaluation unit, it should be clear to you that the report has a major impact on the compensation amount provided to the injured worker. So it's critical that our reports be accurate, that they be well supported, and that they be a truthful and accurate representation of the injured worker's actual status. And given the limited evaluations, in other words, the number of evaluations that can be obtained in these cases is not infinite. It's actually very finite, and they're all provided at the employer's expense. The primary treating physician's report can often be the sole report that resolves the disputed issue, but in those cases where the primary treating physician's report cannot resolve the disputed issues, then we as qualified medical evaluators get called in to resolve the disputed issues. And so it's essential for our reports to be comprehensive, accurate, and just. And before we move on, let me just say a couple of words about this. As you get into your career as a qualified medical evaluator, you may begin to hear various terms such as applicant-oriented qualified medical evaluators and defense-oriented qualified medical evaluators. And I'm sure you can imagine what those monikers may suggest. What I'm encouraging you, and this is what I tell other doctors when they ask me, many times doctors will ask me, they'll say, Perry, are you applicant-oriented QME? Are you a defense-oriented QME? What is your orientation? And I always respond the same way. My orientation is towards accuracy. I'm always seeking the truthful and most accurate outcome to every single case. And that's what I want to encourage you to do as a qualified medical evaluator, because only accurate and truthful opinions and conclusions and outcomes can be properly supported. And we're going to get to support and we're going to get to substantial medical evidence. And you're going to see, and you're going to agree with me, that only truthful and accurate opinions can be properly supported with substantial medical evidence. When you try to fit a round peg in a square hole, and when you try to opine in your report in some way, shape, or form that's not accurate, you're going to find that it's very, very difficult to do, because the support for an inaccurate conclusion is often inaccurate and is often even lacking. And so it's only truthful and accurate opinions and conclusions that can be properly supported with how and why reasoning and with substantial medical evidence. And so always seek the accurate and truthful outcome in each and every case, and you'll never go wrong. Now, as you know and you've heard, our permanent disability evaluations in the state of California are now governed, and I say now because it seems like a new occurrence in the course of history that we're using the AMA guides. But for you as new qualified medical evaluators, you don't know anything different but the AMA guides. But I'm telling you that in the life span of workers' compensation, the adoption and the incorporation of the AMA guides into our current system is relatively new. So we're now using the AMA guides, and let's say a little bit here in this particular discussion about the philosophy of the AMA guides and how the AMA guides factor in to our permanent disability evaluations. So as I said, in the state of California, the AMA guides are new, and the AMA guides were introduced January 1st, 2005. But before that official date of our beginning to use the AMA guides, it was in 2003 that legislative reforms introduced some new changes to the laws. Those laws then got passed, and the purpose of those laws were to integrate the AMA Guides 5th edition into our permanent disability evaluations here in the state of California. Now, it's very, very interesting. In California, we do disability evaluations, but the AMA guides have to deal with the evaluation of permanent impairment. We're going to define impairment, and we're going to define disability here in just a couple minutes. But these are different words, and these are different terms, and these are different ideas and different concepts. And we're sort of dealing with an apples and oranges situation. And I'll share with you how the workers' compensation system resolves that difference. But the AMA guides were introduced in 2005, 1/1/2005, and they've now become the norm as to how we resolve these cases. So the AMA guides completely changed how permanent disability ratings are determined. Before we had the AMA guides, we had a completely different system, and I'll share a little bit about that system with you, because you are going to encounter bits and pieces and terms from that system as you go throughout your career as a qualified medical evaluator. So under the AMA guides, physicians are now responsible, and we say now because this is new and different. We're now responsible for delivering an impairment rating using the AMA guides, and for those cases where we do provide an impairment rating, we're required by law and we're obligated to provide also an apportionment determination that tells the parties what are the causes, the various causes of that examinee's impairment. And we'll talk about how those causes are reimbursed and compensated as we get into our apportionment determinations. But just put this behind your left ear for now to know that in every single case where you provide an impairment rating, you're required by law to then offer also an apportionment determination. And we'll talk much more about that in a future session. So this new approach under the AMA guides excludes assessments of some of the former considerations that used to go into a determination of the disability rating, such as subjective disability factors, such as objective disability factors. These are two separate and distinct considerations that contributed to disability ratings. Also, permanent work restrictions used to be a major factor in determining the disability rating. And finally, loss of pre-injury capacity was the fourth consideration that went into permanent disability rating awards. So we had number 1, subjective factors of disability, 2, objective factors of disability, 3 is permanent work restrictions, and 4, loss of pre-injury capacity. Those were the contributing elements that resulted in a permanent disability rating under our old system, but that old system has now been replaced with a determination of impairment under the AMA guides. So we no longer use any of these former factors in coming up with our disability ratings. However, work restrictions, you're still going to be commenting on work restrictions within the body of your report, not so much for the determination of the permanent disability, but for determining the examinee's or injured worker's ability or inability to return back to the pre-injury occupation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of the AMA guides. So let's talk a little bit about the philosophy of the AMA guides and what is it that we expect that the AMA guides bring newly to the system of evaluating injured workers. Well, the AMA guides supposedly are supposed to provide an objective method to evaluate medical impairments. And this is different compared to our prior system that largely relied on subjective considerations. In fact, one of the 4 of the contributors to the permanent disability rating was what were referred to as subjective factors of disability, and the AMA guides tries to eliminate some of these subjective contributors to the disability rating. The AMA guides aims for a consistent impairment rating regardless of the evaluating physician, and stated in a different way, what this means is that consistency among evaluating physicians is the hoped for outcome of using the AMA guides, such that any evaluator could come up with the same impairment rating for the same examinee given the same circumstances. The AMA Guides 5th edition enhances the diagnostic criteria and the evaluation process by integrating available scientific evidence and prevalent medical opinions. However, despite the publication of the 6th edition in 2008, more than 15 years ago, still the California Workers' Compensation still relies on the 5th edition, and it's only the 5th edition that is written into workers' compensation law. So the 6th edition was published more than 15 years ago, but we still use the 5th edition here in California Workers' Compensation. So let's define a couple of important terms that are described in both the AMA guides and in California Workers' Compensation. The first of which is impairment, and you can think of impairment as a loss of use, or a loss of function of a body part, body system, or body region. So here it is, the exact definition. It says a loss or a dysfunction, so that's loss of use, or loss of function of any body part, body organ system, or body region, indicating a deviation from a normative state. The normative state can be based upon the individual's healthy condition or on population averages. So again, impairment, and you can remember this phrase, is a loss of use, or loss of function of a body part, a body region, organ, or organ system. So, for example, a loss, an amputation, would be a loss of a body part, okay? We don't have to have a loss of a body part. We could simply have a loss of use or a loss of function of that body part, and that would constitute an impairment. Now, disability, on the other hand, is a limitation in performing tasks, and in California, we're primarily focused on work tasks due to an impairment. Impaired individuals may not necessarily have a disability. The distinction is significant. So in California, we provide disability ratings to compensate injured workers for what is referred to as loss of future earning capacity. It used to be in California that we compensated injured workers for their reduced ability to compete in the open labor market. That's how disability ratings were established, by calculating a percentage of loss of the ability to compete in the open labor market. Now our current system under the AMA guides is that we as qualified medical evaluators provide an impairment rating. The impairment rating is then converted into a disability rating, and the disability rating is intended to compensate the injured worker for the injured worker's diminished future earning capacity as a result of the particular impairment that they have, which is described by us as the qualified medical evaluator. Now, if you look at the charts and tables within the AMA guides, most of the impairment ratings that you're going to find throughout the charts and tables usually provide for a range of impairment values. And in this example, we have an example of a range of impairment values from 15 to 18%. Other impairments will range from 5 to 8% or 10 to 19%. And the AMA guides provide a range of values. And you as the qualified medical evaluator can assign your examinee a particular value within the range by using your clinical judgment. And the guides tell us that the range that you select within the value that you select within the range is based upon the severity of the impairment and the impact of that impairment on the examinees to perform activities of daily living, whereas greater impact on activities of daily living will justify the use of a higher value within the range. For example, the 18% value compared to the 15% value. Okay, so you're going to become expert in assessing your examinees' activities of daily living, and this is a skill that we'll talk about developing in our ongoing sessions. But just suffice to say that your activities of daily living assessment is something that you need to focus on and develop. So in the AMA guides, I believe it's table 1.2, right in the first chapter of the book, they talk about the relevant activities of daily living, including self-care activities, communication activities, physical activities, sensory activities, sensory functions, non-specialized hand activities, travel activities, sexual function activities, and sleep. And these, of course, are not the only categories of activities of daily living, but these are the specific categories that are described in the AMA guides, and each of these main categories have several activities within these main categories. For example, with self-care, there's bathing, there's dressing, there's combing the hair, there's using the toilet. So many activities underneath each of these main topic headings, and we'll explore some of these as we move on in our discussions. So impairment ratings within the chapters, charts, and tables of the AMA guides reflect the severity of the impairment and the extent of limitations that impairment imposes upon activities of daily living, considering the body part, the body region, the organ or the organ system involved. Most chapters provide what's referred to as a WPI, a whole person impairment, whereas chapters 15, 16, and 17 are unique chapters in that they provide regional impairments that are then converted into whole person impairment. So for example, in chapter 16, the upper extremity impairment, the upper extremity chapter 16 provides regional impairments, including the region of the hand, the region of the upper extremity, and then those regional impairments are then converted to the next higher level of impairment. So for example, there's finger impairments then get converted into hand impairments then get converted into the next larger unit, which is upper extremity impairments, and then finally upper extremity impairments are converted into whole person impairments. And then an examinee who has multiple whole person impairments based upon multiple body regions involved, all of those whole person individual values then get combined through the use of the combined values chart on page 604. Whole person impairment ratings start at 0% whole person, which indicates that there is no significant functional loss or impact of that particular impairment on the individual's ability to perform and carry out routine activities of daily living. So that's a 0% impairment value. And you'll have examinees who, despite their subjective complaints and despite even some objective findings, if that impairment, whatever it may be, has no significant impact on activities of daily living, then by definition, that impairment does not qualify for an impairment rating, a whole person impairment rating. So they start at 0% and then they go up to 90 to 100%. 100%, of course, will be an impairment approaching death. And I remember some calculations that related to Christopher Reeve. You remember Christopher Reeve was a quadriplegic after a horseback riding accident. And Christopher Reeve's whole person impairment rating was in the low 90%. So even Christopher Reeve did not qualify for the highest of the impairment values, because the highest impairment value of 100% basically signifies a complete loss of function of the body as a whole. The whole person, 100% whole person impairment is basically a death condition. Now, typically and by law, and we talked about this law earlier in our last session, the law is Labor Code Section 4660. Now, by law, impairment ratings are described using the AMA guides. And as we stated, Labor Code Section 4660 tells us that the AMA guides provide prima facie evidence of the accuracy and correctness of the impairment. So we rate impairments through the use of the AMA guides. However, thanks to a couple of important cases that came around between the years of 2005 and 2010, these cases are collectively known as the Alvarez and Guzman cases. They were two separate cases at the time. They became consolidated cases, and now they're simply referred to as the Alvarez-Guzman cases. These cases came along and provided for some exceptions and some circumstances wherein impairments can be rated outside of the typical chart, chapter, table, or method that's described in the AMA guides. And Alvarez and Guzman impairment ratings are referred to as alternative impairment ratings. The opposite of alternative impairment ratings is conventional impairment ratings, and it's the AMA guides that provide the conventional impairment rating. But the philosophy on Alvarez and Guzman alternative impairment ratings is that not all conditions are accurately rated or even described in the AMA guides. For example, plantar fasciitis as a foot condition is not described in the AMA guides, but plantar fasciitis is a bona fide painful symptomatic condition. Plantar fasciitis is a condition that can result in one or more different types of permanent impairment, but plantar fasciitis itself is not described in the AMA guides, and plantar fasciitis is not unique. There are many impairing conditions that examinees present with that are not described in the AMA guides. So what can we do? Well, it was the Alvarez and Guzman line of cases that provided for us a methodology whereby we could accurately rate examinees who have conditions that either are not described in the AMA guides or that are poorly described or not accurately described in the AMA guides. So the Alvarez and Guzman decisions, and these were en banc decisions, important legal case decisions that are now binding precedent on all the courts throughout the state of California. They provide an alternative approach for rating disabilities in complex or extraordinary cases where the standard or conventional AMA guides rating may not accurately represent the worker's impairment. So for example, with plantar fasciitis, let's use that example. If you evaluate an examinee who has plantar fasciitis, that examinee will probably have normal range of motion of the foot and ankle, normal strength to resisted manual muscle testing of the foot and ankle neurologic exam, the vascular exam will all be normal. And according to the strict application of the AMA guides, that plantar fasciitis condition will not qualify for an impairment rating under the standard or conventional application of the AMA guides. But this condition, painful plantar fasciitis, actually causes impairments, and this Alvarez and Guzman line of cases provides for us a mechanism whereby we can provide impairments that are accurate in cases where the AMA guides are inadequate. Okay, how did I phrase that? I think that's an accurate description of the philosophy behind Alvarez and Guzman alternative impairment ratings. So let's explore these a little bit more. Okay, so let's talk about alternative impairment ratings under Alvarez and Guzman. Now, when you provide an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, you're basically rebutting the permanent disability rating that's provided for by the AMA guides. And as we said, according to Labor Code Section 4660, the AMA guides are prima facie evidence. Okay, they're presumed to be correct evidence of the accuracy of the impairment. So according to the AMA guides, an examinee who has plantar fasciitis qualifies in most cases for 0% whole person impairment, and this 0% whole person impairment is presumed correct by law. Now, if you provide an alternative impairment rating, you're basically rebutting the AMA guides, and it can be done. We have an allowance in law that allows it to be done, but it can only be done in a very specific and exacting way, which you must follow in each and every case. Otherwise, the alternative impairment rating will not succeed. So you can challenge the permanent disability rating by rebutting one of its components, or by rebutting its components, one of which is the whole person impairment. And this goes back to our discussion of Labor Code Section 4660. We said that there were several components that go into a whole person impairment rating. One was the permanent disability rating. One was the whole person impairment percentage provided by you as the qualified medical evaluator. The second was the age of the examinee at the date of injury. The third was the occupation of the examinee at the date of the injury. And those two components, the age and the occupation, are not components that can be rebutted. What can be rebutted about the examinee's age? Basically nothing. So the whole person impairment is one of the most commonly and most rebuttable of the components of the permanent disability rating. So by providing an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, you're basically rebutting the AMA guides and the whole person impairment rating that's provided for by the AMA guides. So to contest or to rebut the whole person impairment rating, the physician can utilize any chart, any table, any chapter, any method within the four corners of the AMA guides. And you're going to hear this expression 1,000 times over the course of your career. We must stay within the four corners of the AMA guides, but we can venture outside of the typical chart, the typical chapter, the typical method that would typically apply. We can venture outside of that, and we can venture anywhere within the four corners of the AMA guides to come up with an alternative impairment rating that is the most accurate description of the examinee's whole person impairment. So again, talking about our example of plantar fasciitis, typically plantar fasciitis would be rated in Chapter 17, the lower extremity chapter. However, Alvarez and Guzman allows us to go outside of Chapter 17 if we find an accurate description of that examinee's impairment outside of Chapter 17. We can use any chapter. We can use Chapter 13. We can use Chapter 15. We can use any chapter, table, any chart, any method within the four corners of the AMA guides, as long as we do it properly. And we'll talk about what constitutes a proper approach to that here in just a few moments. Now, over the years since the Alvarez and Guzman cases came to the popular culture, there have been some limits that have been discovered to the approach of rating impairments through an alternative method. The courts have told us that the Alvarez and Guzman standard doesn't simply grant physicians the freedom to randomly pick any method from the AMA guides with the purpose of obtaining a specific desired outcome. And you can imagine that the specific desired outcome would be a higher impairment rating. Why would you use any impairment rating method besides the standard or conventional rating unless it produced a higher impairment rating value? So simply using alternative impairment descriptors for your examinee's impairment that provide for higher impairment ratings are not necessarily going to succeed, because the parties quickly can detect that you're simply using an alternative impairment rating to achieve a better desired outcome. Therefore, any deviation from the standard or conventional rating must be underpinned by substantial medical evidence. And we'll talk exactly about how to do that here in just a moment. The physician's judgment must be accompanied by robust factual support and reasoning to validate the rating. And you can imagine that this must be so because in almost every single case, an alternative impairment rating provides for a higher impairment rating than the strict or conventional rating provided for by the AMA guides. Therefore, your higher impairment rating, which is sometimes double the standard rating, sometimes triple the standard rating, whatever, must be accompanied by robust factual support and solid reasoning, how and why reasoning that is substantial, that therefore validates the higher impairment rating. Stated quite simply, there must be compelling medical evidence to justify any deviation from the regular, standard, or conventional approach described in the AMA guides, because the regular, standard, or conventional approach described by the AMA guides is considered to be the correct rating by law, by Labor Code Section 4660. So in providing an alternative impairment rating, you're basically going against the law. You're rebutting the law, and your rebuttal has to be good. It has to be robust, it has to be compelling, and it has to be substantial. Now, if you're going to provide an alternative impairment rating under Alvarez and Guzman, and you're going to attempt to rebut the standard rating provided for by the conventional chart, table, or chapter within the AMA guides, how you document that alternative impairment rating and how you report that alternative impairment rating. And this comes under the general topic heading of medical legal report writing. How you report it is critical. If you want that alternative impairment rating to be the rating under which the case is closed and settled, then it has to be done according to exacting standards. So if you're going to employ an alternative impairment rating, you should specifically label your alternative impairment rating as such, and you should include this in a separate section within the overall section of the permanent impairment rating section of your report. So in the permanent impairment rating section of your report, you can think of this section of your report being divided in two subsections. Number one, and at the top, would be your strict or standard impairment rating directly out of the AMA guides. And then underneath that would be an area where you could provide any opinion on any alternative impairment rating that you plan on employing. For context and clarity, a rating consistent or compliant with the AMA guides should also be included. In other words, always provide the standard rating. Never simply provide an alternative impairment rating without first providing the strict impairment rating to indicate to the parties that you know what the strict impairment rating is, and you're electing and choosing to provide an alternative impairment rating by employing your clinical expertise and judgment, and set it out in your report in such a way that the parties can see that you actually know what you're doing. This allows for a clear comparison and aids in explaining why the standard rating may not genuinely reflect the injured worker's impairment. Now, over the years since the Alvarez and Guzman line of cases have been settled and resolved, there has evolved in case law a four-step formula that you must employ in order to qualify your alternative impairment rating as a substantial alternative impairment rating. In other words, all opinions and conclusions that you offer within the body of your report must qualify as substantial medical evidence, and the qualification or the qualifier for your alternative impairment rating is a higher level of substantial medical evidence. There is a specific formula to make your alternative impairment rating substantial, and it's known as the four-step formula. So the four-step formula is step number one is to provide the conventional impairment rating that's provided for in the AMA guides. Step number one. Step number two is to tell us why that conventional rating is not accurate in the case of your particular examinee. Step number 3 then would be to go ahead and provide an alternative impairment rating from somewhere within the 4 corners of the AMA guides, and then tell us why this alternative impairment rating is the most accurate description of your examinee's impairment. Now you'll notice of these 4 steps, steps number 1 and steps number 3 are the easy steps where you simply provide the rating. You provide the strict rating, you provide the alternative impairment rating. Those are easy. It's steps number 2 and steps number 4 that make your opinion substantial. You have to then think and come up with substantial reasons, many compelling and voluminous reasons, as to why the conventional impairment rating is not accurate. In the case of plantar fasciitis, a 0% whole person impairment rating is not accurate because it doesn't accurately describe the limitations that an examinee with plantar fasciitis has for walking, for standing in one place for an extended period of time, for running, and really for weight-bearing activities in general. People with chronic and symptomatic plantar fasciitis have limitations with weight-bearing activities, but there is no conventional impairment rating within the AMA guides for plantar fasciitis. So you would tell us why that conventional impairment rating is not accurate. And then you would provide the alternative impairment rating. And then again in step number 4, you have to put on your thinking cap and utilize your communication skills to tell us why the alternative rating is most accurate. And your alternative impairment rating might be, for example, gait derangement. And that gait derangement, instead of coming out of Chapter 17, which does describe impairments due to gait derangement, it might come out of Chapter 13. Chapter 13 describes gait derangement and impairments of gait due to neurologic disorders. But the description in Chapter 13 may be a more accurate description than the description in Chapter 17. So this is an example where you're allowed to jump out of the conventional chapter, which would be Chapter 17, and jump into a different chapter within the 4 corners of the AMA guides, as long as you can explain why that alternative impairment rating is most accurate, and as long as you can explain why with multiple compelling and voluminous reasons, with emphasis on the compellingness of the reasons. More important than voluminous reasons are compelling reasons based upon the facts of the case. If you can satisfy this 4-step formula, then you can get creative with your impairment ratings, and you can jump outside of the conventional rating, and you can effectively rebut the AMA guides. And so these are just some scratching the surface of ideas about rating permanent impairments within the state of California. It's primarily based upon the AMA guides, but we do have tremendous latitude thanks to the Alvarez and Guzman cases that allow us to get creative in describing our examinees' actual impairment most accurately.